So one thing I've noticed, and as I hear other people who learn nonviolent communication, is it helps me get a better understanding about why I'm reacting in certain ways in certain situations. And that doesn't need to be in war situations. It can be day to day, having a disagreement with my friend or my wife or my girlfriend. I'm having we're having an argument. What it does is it can help us shift the argument to what's really important.
Hi there, welcome back to a new episode of Activism Collectors podcast. Through this project founded by European Solidarity Corps, we are trying to showcase the people which are making a real difference in their communities. We are also trying to promote volunteering and social cohesion through new technologies and projects.
So, hello, welcome to the podcast Activism Collectors. My name is Anton Toshev. I am an ESC volunteer coming from Bulgaria, and here I have a very, very interesting person. Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name's Ian Peatey. Did I say more?
Please, yeah.
Because I guess that's not the only interesting thing about me. I was born in Britain, and for half my adult life I've been living in Eastern Europe. So I arrived in Poland in 1994, so just after the big changes, so a few years after. And I lived there for 15 years, and then I moved to Romania about 15 years ago. So I have a Romanian wife and a daughter who's now 14. And I guess what brings me here is nonviolent communication, which is something I discovered in 2001. And I was fortunate, I was at a conference in the UK, and I didn't go to learn about nonviolent communication. But Marshall Rosenberg, who was the founder of this particular approach to communication and conflict resolution and social change, was one of the keynote speakers. So I heard him presenting his stories, his model of communication, his approach, and I had this very clear idea at the end of the 2 hours that this is going to change the world. And that was in 2001. Unfortunately, it's taken quite some time to change the world, but I guess anyone involved with activism or education kind of understands that this kind of thing it's a long-term project. It's not something with quick fixes. And then I kind of changed my life. About a year after I started sharing MVC, teaching it, learning more about it, really kind of immersing myself in it. At the time when I learned about it, I was in business. I was working for a multinational as an accountant, of all things. So It was a very radical change. Because one thing that Marshall did for me is he kind of opened my eyes to see that we've created a world that works for some people but not for everybody. And his dream and his vision and the organisation that he established, the Centre for Nonviolent Communication, are working towards a world that works for everybody, not just the people who have access to resources and power. So that was a big shift for me, if you can imagine, working in a multinational corporation, which was all about power and money. So it kind of turned the way that I saw the world on its head. And he also provided some very simple tools that I found very helpful in my life and my relationships. So in 2008, I became a certified trainer. There's about 950 certified trainers across the world. And last year I became an assessor. So one of the roles of being an assessor with the Centre for Nonviolent Communication is to support people who want to become trainers, who want to become certified trainers. So I mentor them, I work with them to help them reach a standard of being able to teach this and work with this in a variety of contexts, many contexts. We work with it. So some of the particular things that I'm focused on, in addition to supporting new trainers, is I'm part of the training team for a 10-day training that we run all over the world. I've also been involved in some Erasmus-funded projects. One we've got at the moment, helping us learn more about trauma and how to support people who have experienced trauma and heal from trauma. Some of my colleagues are working in Ukraine. I've got one colleague in particular who's working on the front line, teaching Ukrainian soldiers how to give emotional support to each other in quite horrific situations. And I have another guy I'm working with who's living in Lebanon, working with a youth theatre there to teach young people about how to communicate. At the moment he's had to leave Beirut because of the attacks. So yeah, it kind of takes us into areas that are stretching people to their limits in many cases. And just to kind of finish this off, this was one of the things that fascinated Marshall Rosenberg, was how is it that some people, when they're faced with such intense situations, so maybe war around them or riots or civil unrest, how is it that some people stay really compassionate and caring for others and themselves, and others go in the opposite direction? And he was really fascinated by what was the difference. And he found that it was how we think and the language that we use. I mean, the two kind of go together, our thinking patterns and the language kind of really fit together. So this was what made the difference, and he he created this approach to kind of give some tools to help stay connected to our caring, compassionate human side.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I was curious, could you give us an example of how an ordinary person, because you mentioned all these, let's say, a bit more extreme situations, but let's say that how would an ordinary person with their ordinary life, how would they use nonviolent communication, and what would be the point?
For me, it starts with my relationship with myself. So one thing I've noticed, and as I hear other people who learn nonviolent communication, is it helps me get a better understanding about why I'm reacting in certain ways in certain situations. And that can be, it doesn't need to be in war situations, it can be day to day, having a disagreement with my friend or my wife or my girlfriend. I'm having we're having an argument. What it does is it can help us shift the argument to what's really important. I remember when I was first married, I was pretty young. I was in my early 20s when I first got married. So I was still a kid. We had a big argument about what's the correct way to cut potatoes.
Okay.
To boil potatoes, to cook potatoes. So potato is they're usually kind of like that. And my wife had been taught by her mother to cut the potatoes along the long way, and I'd been taught to cut them across the short edge. And we had this huge fight, and this is kind of typical in many relationships. We fight about the most ridiculous, stupid things. But if we can get beyond that, and this is what nonviolent communication does, is it helps us see what's really important in this. Why is it so important to me? And it's about, in that situation, it was about respect. It was about it was that understanding, being respecting what I'd learnt in life. And it was the same for my wife. She wanted exactly the same. But because we were fighting over how to cut potatoes, we never got to the point where we could say, why is this so important to both of us? And then when we can see that, why it's important, then we can work out, what to do about it. So if I'm cooking potatoes, I cut it my way. If you cut potatoes your way, then there's really no problem. There's no fight. So I mean, I'm a bit embarrassed about that example, to be honest. It gives ways to connect, as I said, with why is this important for me? If I'm feeling angry about something, or frustrated, or excited, or happy, what is it in me that is making me feel this way? And most of us were raised to believe it's the other person who's making us feel a particular way. So I was raised as a child to believe that my wife, in this case, or friends or family, were making me feel a particular way. So I wasn't taking responsibility for my own feelings. And then that creates conflict.
So from what I understand, going back to be honest, a very relatable example of how I cut potato versus how you cut potato. Could you say that it's more or less about how we're raised, and then when the two different habitual learnings clash, then we have a conflict, and then how we tackle the difference is what makes all the difference?
Exactly, it's how we tackle the differences. And the language that I would use if I'm teaching nonviolent communication, but it's simply kind of jargon, is it's a strategy. So cutting a potato a particular way is a strategy for efficiently cooking a potato. It's as simple as that. It's about efficiency. And my wife also wants efficiency, but she was taught a different way. So what I try to do with my kids, I've got 3 daughters, and I would, advise anybody who is working with kids or raising kids, or is a younger person, to really explore what's really important for me in situations that are bothering me with people around me. What are the things that make me angry? But rather than looking out there and saying, you're making me angry, what is that anger telling me about myself, about what's important for me? And the other thing that happens, and I really would like to, particularly with children as they're kind of growing up and making sense of the world, the difference between what I'm seeing and what I'm interpreting, what I'm judging. So just coming back to this embarrassing potato situation.
Okay.
I noticed that I'm seeing my wife is cutting the potatoes in a particular way. That's what I'm seeing. But then I have a story. She's wrong. That's the wrong way to do it. I know the right way to do it.
Of course.
And it's that wrong thinking then. And it's the thinking is not the cutting the potatoes. It's my thinking about it. So whenever I think, I've got the answer, I'm right, you're wrong, or I'm judging, I'm labeling, God, my wife is so stupid. I mean, how can anyone, there's a right way to cut potatoes, and anyone who does it differently is stupid. This is the kind of thinking that we if we're not careful, we educate our kids, because we're so used to judging and evaluating, and it creates unnecessary conflict. It creates so many problems in the world. So there's a flavour of a few kind of just tools, tips to kind of calm down and have communication that's connecting, that's bringing us together, that's not creating unnecessary conflict, disagreement.
All right, so for example, if you have a conflict with, let's say somebody who is close to you, and you don't really know nonviolent communication, but let's say that you get more or less the point. So what would make sense for a person who isn't acquainted it's the first time they hear about NVC, nonviolent communication, but they're very curious, they care about the person, but they are also very proud and they have habits. And these habits are, let's say, jumping to specific reactions which are habitual, like the person is used to, they may have good intentions, but they sort of snap or jump.
So a couple of things that I would recommend. First of all is to remind myself of my intention. So if I'm seeing something that I'm not enjoying, let's say my kid is beating up his or her sibling, he's having a fight, and I want to talk to my kid. What's my intention? Is it to educate them? Is it to make them feel ashamed? Is it to humiliate them?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it to just connect and understand and have a heart-to-heart conversation about this? So that intention is really important, because that will determine the energy, the words, the tone of voice. It will determine many things. If I think you're wrong or you're bad in any way and I want to correct you, that will influence very significantly how I talk to you and how you'll hear me, and that will create resistance. So I want to check my intention. Is my intention to be curious about, why is it that you're hitting your sibling?
Mm.
What's going on with you?
Mm-hmm.
You must be pretty angry. So I might attempt to guess and get in contact with what you're feeling. And particularly for kids, it's going to be quite confusing, our emotional world. So just being with them, being present with their emotions. What do I'm guessing you're pretty angry. What happened? And then you just kind of let them talk, listen. And this is the other thing, is to really listen with an intention to understand. Because often we're listening to be able to disagree, to be able to see what your arguments are, so I can then present my arguments, and we then get into who's right, who's wrong. But I want to listen to really understand what's going on with you.
Okay, so what I'm getting is that maybe it's a good idea to try and connect a little bit with them and verbally, practically try to guess how they might be feeling, like make assumptions.
Yeah.
And do a bit of a check-in, like, hey, is this how you might have felt? Yes, no, then, give me an idea, like tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
And try to replace it with this very typical, I would say, human behavior, which is to have this readiness to push back, fight back, disagree, disconnect. And speaking of disconnection, kids or even adults sometimes don't really want to connect. For example, there is a situation, it could be something smaller like the earlier example, or something a bit more serious, like maybe they have a story in their head about some sort of betrayal, and that's only one-sided. The other person may have no idea what the situation is about, and the person with the story who's actually experiencing this negative feeling, what if they don't wish to connect? They don't wish to cooperate. They don't wish to find a solution, let's say, at that given moment. What would you practically suggest?
Well, there's two things. I've got two options in communication at all times. So what I described earlier was about listening with curiosity. What's going on with you? Mm-hmm. But if you're not prepared to talk to me, you don't want to connect, you've got something else is going on for you, then I've got a second option, which is to tell you what's going on for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is about being honest, not about what I'm thinking about you. So most of us are trained to, we're raised to do it something like, come on, you need to answer me. We need to sort this out. There's something wrong with you.
There's no time.
Yeah,
we got to do this now.
It's about you. It's about external.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Whereas what I would be encouraging people to do and teaching people to do is to speak up in the first person. So what's going on for me?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to connect with you here. I would really love to resolve this, and right now I'm feeling really frustrated because I need to move forward with this. Would you be willing to tell me something about what's happening with you right now? I speak up with honesty about how, and of course there's no guarantee that you're going to shift, and then I need to, I can maybe try a couple of times, and then I've done what I can do. There's no guarantee that any communication method is going to reach perfect communication with everybody, anytime, any place. Of course not. That would be, ridiculous for me to claim that. So all I can do is what is the best that I can do, and that's to listen and to speak up from the first person. And if you listen to how most people speak in conversation, a lot of it is about you, particularly when there's kind of adult to kids, or mature adults to youth. It's like It's about you and what you're doing wrong and what you should be doing. And so I want to talk about myself, not about you. That's more likely to get connection. As I said, it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, of course, there is no such thing as universal solution to every problem or every conflict. So how do you assess that sometimes it's good to, try to tackle the situation, try to make connection, try to, reach a conclusion? Because sometimes, we're human beings, we're emotional. Sometimes we, certain chemical reactions, happen within us, and sometimes we're just not always in the right state of mind, if you will. We can't always think clearly, especially if there's an emotion. So how do you assess?
Well, first of all, I would always advise anybody who's in a relationship with somebody, whether it's a friendship, a family member, an intimate relationship, to choose the timing well.
Okay.
Because we are much more likely to solve the problem. We're much more likely to get closer if we're both in a good place.
Mm-hmm.
If we're both in a good mood. But if we try and deal with a situation when I'm feeling angry and you're feeling angry, the chances of success are pretty small. So I would always want to create some breathing space, take a break, we'll come back to this later. And that's not giving up. It's kind of putting it to one side, knowing that I'm going to come back later when we're both able to listen to each other, we're both able to express ourselves in ways that aren't responding to these chemical reactions that are, somehow make us say things that we then regret. We didn't quite mean what we said, but this happens to all of us. Okay.
Exactly. I just wanted to make it as relatable as possible to me, to the viewers, because we do have, all of us are human beings and we have these moments. So what I understand is it's okay sometimes to give a pause and just let things cool down. And
yeah, it's also okay to completely screw things up sometimes. There are times, even recent times, when I make a complete mess of my communication. Something comes out of my mouth and no, but it's already out there, or I'm not in control because I'm really angry about something, or the other person is. But then I've got some tools, in my back pocket that I can bring out to heal that, to repair the damage. So I learn how to apologize in a way that heals the damage that I've caused. I express my regret, and I'm calming down as I'm doing that. I'm feeling really sad that I said those words. And my intention at the time was I just was really desperate to be heard. Is there something I can do to heal the damage? Is there something else you'd like to hear from me? These kind of vulnerable, open-hearted approaches. It's not a technique. I really want to, and this is when I'm working with future trainers, this really needs to come from the heart. It needs to come from a very authentic place, because people are not stupid. They know when they're being manipulated by a tool or a technique. So a lot of the work that I'm doing and I've done on myself is to really make it integrated. So it's I'm not bringing out a tool. This is coming from a genuine, authentic place. So if I'm saying sorry, it's really, I'm sorry, I'm sad, I wish that I hadn't done that. I'm not doing it just to try to make you feel better.
So what I'm hearing is being authentic. So for example, as you said, if I'm going to be sorry and I'm going to voice my apology, then it's actually for real. And it's not just a habitual, automatic, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's also about the intention.
Yeah. And also on the other side, it's about every time I express myself, it's coming from an authentic, genuine place. Every time I'm listening to you, it's with genuine interest and curiosity. I want to understand. I want to know what's going on with you. And this is especially true with people that are close. We have limited time and energy. So with what, 8 billion, 7 billion people on the
Give or
planet,
take,
yeah. Clearly I don't have time to deal with everybody. So, we all have, a certain number of relationships that are really important for us. Those are the ones that are worth paying more attention to. If I'm working, as an educator or with youth, or with activism, I'd like to talk a little bit about activism, then, I have people in front of me that are important to me, either because I want to change what they're doing, because I don't like what they're doing, or they're in my care, their safety is in my care, their education is in my care, their well-being, whatever the context is. So it's worth investing in, figuring out how best to communicate. And you said earlier, we have patterns, we have habits of communication, and that's actually the tricky bit of learning kind of a new way of thinking about communication. Is I need to unlearn those patterns, those habits, and that can be tricky. People who are approaching this at a younger age have it much easier because they haven't developed bad habits of communication. And kids are naturals at this. There's a couple of schools in Romania, for example, that are based on nonviolent communication without naming it that way. And the kids are naturals. They listen to each other, they express themselves, they solve their conflicts themselves. They don't need to bring an adult in to kind of come in and decide, who's right, who's wrong, and solve the conflict. They can do it themselves. There's a growing number of schools around the world where the schools are based on these principles, and the educators are taught and learn this approach. There's one in Timișoara, which is a big school. There's a couple in Bucharest. And across Europe, there's many schools and kindergartens that are based on this. This is kind of recognizing that this is where social change starts, is with how we're educating our kids.
So Ian, I wanted to ask you, I know that you also do online trainings, so you work in the context of online and online communication, and maybe our viewers can relate. Sometimes it's very difficult to work with people, communicate with people, even manage people online, even if it's in a Zoom call or sometimes even written email or just this kind of long distance communication. What is your opinion on that as somebody who's actually gone through every process?
So, most of my work is online, so I do a lot of individual meetings and workshops and group work online, especially since the pandemic, when I think many of us shifted more to online interaction out of necessity. For me, the principles are the same, it's just we need to work a little bit harder, and especially not to jump to conclusions and make assumptions, because the data we're getting from the limited form of screen connection means we're missing a lot. So we're missing a lot of body language, which we may not consciously know if we're sitting face to face, but it's there. We're constantly communicating through our eye contact, through face expression, through our gestures, how we're sitting, without really being consciously aware of it. And we miss a whole load of that online. So I find it's very easy to get into misunderstandings online because sometimes we miss that more subtle clues about how somebody's feeling, for example. Especially if we've got a number of people on the screen, we pick up a lot of clues about emotional content from face expressions, and we kind of miss a large part of that. So I need to work a bit harder to what I would say is what I would describe as a kind of a positive intention towards people, and not to jump to conclusions. Not to potentially misread, a face expression. He's bored, or she's disagreeing, or they're not interested. It's so easy to make these assumptions, and then I'm kind of not able to communicate effectively then. So I want to get better at maybe asking, inquiring. If I notice, this person over here, so she seems to be in disagreement, I might just acknowledge that and say, I'm seeing a face expression and I'm having a hard time reading it. Could you tell me what's going on with you? So to maybe more explicitly bring the emotional content, because that's usually where we get challenges and difficulties in our connections with people. Makes it much harder to communicate, to collaborate, to work together, if we're not able to read the emotional signs. So I want to maybe be a bit more explicit about that, bring it to the surface by asking, by checking with them. I'm seeing on your face expression what looks to me like anger. Is that what's going on with you?
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about it? Because it's important to recognise it and talk about it. It's not easy if we've been raised to dismiss emotions as being irrelevant, which many of us have, unfortunately. But emotions are part of being alive. It's part of the fun of being alive. And when we ignore them, we miss part of life. And they're also important signals that something important is done. So if I recognise that you're angry at something I said, I want to know about it. What's important for you that's been stimulated? And this is tricky. It's not easy online. And then there's written, kind of digital communication, written text, social media, etc. And there I just want to be more careful, because it's very easy to write something, press send, and then it's out there. I can't bring it back. With most systems, I'm not able to bring it back. With some, maybe I can bring it back if I'm very quick. But mostly, it's out there, and it contains even fewer clues about what's going on. I mean, I'm sure you've read a text message that you've read as, "Oh my God, they're angry with me." And I've read that entirely myself into the words. Unless they've specifically said, "I'm angry," there's something about, we interpret, we're trying to make sense. And when we don't have the person's voice, face in front of us. So I would really want to take a lot more care. And, there's this advice that I hear often, that if you're upset about something and you want to write a mail or a text message, write it but don't send it. Sit on it for 24 hours before sending it. Because then when you've calmed down, when the situation is not really right in your face, you might change the wording. Because no matter, I was brought up with this children's rhyme, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me." Honestly, that's rubbish. Mm-hmm. Words hurt a lot. Mm-hmm. In fact, we can hurt people, I think, in the long term with words, particularly younger people, because as they're forming their identity, finding their place in the world, the messages that they receive form their worldview and their view about themselves. So if they hear, "You're lazy, you're lazy, you're lazy," you hear that 3 or 4 times, then they start to build a concept of themselves around that. So I want to be careful in my written communication. Pay attention, and the principles are the same. So speak about myself. Speak about what's going on for me, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, what's important for me, what I want to happen, and not about the other person. So I have a personal rule. Whenever I'm speaking for myself, I want to use the first person, and I rarely use the second person form in grammar. So because it's about you, and that's invasive. I'm invading your boundaries and your barriers. Mm-hmm. When I talk about you, what I think about you, or what you are, or who you are, or what you're doing. I want to talk about what I'm reacting to and what that reaction is. And that's the same with written.
So I guess what you mean is, for for example, even if when you're trying to speak about yourself, like let's say for example, instead of saying I feel this way because when I do this, this happens. And normally in the real life, let's say, the life that I know as a person who's been, brought by parents who have these habits, I learned from them to say, when you feel this way, when this happens to you, I'm talking about myself, but I'm actually using the you form instead of the I form. And sometimes that can be very confusing for the communication between the people. And I find it a bit difficult, and I'm sure that other people also who are discovering the I form find it a bit difficult to keep this habit, because more or less the entire world, give or take, has been trained, conditioned in this manner of speaking.
Yeah.
So it can be tricky, and it could, as you said, require more work. But I want to go back on when you said about written communication and always using I form and always making sure to be gentle, even in some cases, because I was imagining, for example, writing a message to my boss or to my colleague, and I have personally tried to do something like this before, and often it's the case that they still react in a negative way. They still have their own concept and story about it.
Yeah.
Even if I really tried my best, and I even used online tools like checking the tone of the message and so on and so on. What then? Do we follow up with a message, or?
Well, you can only do what you can do. So if you've paid attention, you've checked it out with some online tools, you've really done your best to make it as clear and as non-judgmental, non-confrontational, if that's what you want. You've done your best, and the other person still reacts. Of course, sometimes people will react even when you've done your best, and then that's about them, that's not about you. And then depending on the relationship, so your question is, what do you do if you've stimulated somebody to get angry, upset, or having a negative reaction towards what you've written? Then I think the next best thing that you can do is listen to them. Hear that without taking it personally, because it's not personal. If you're, let's say they've asked you to do something. They've asked you to write an article about something, and you don't have time to do it, you don't have interest in doing it, and you express that. You say, no, I don't want to do that because of X, Y, Z. And you form it in the best way that you can. Then they have difficulty in hearing your no because they're disappointed. There might be other things going on for them, but they're not getting you to do what they want to do. So that's their problem, not yours. You can make it your problem. So, but I wouldn't advise making it your problem. So listen to them, and that's difficult. Listening to somebody online with written communication is really difficult. I wouldn't necessarily advise that. If in this situation, your boss is the one that's upset with you, I would want to meet them, have a meeting with them, online or face to face, and listen. So I'm guessing you're upset because you really wanted that article written. And then they can talk and say yes, and then you might hear something that actually changes your mind. I'd also like to be open when I'm listening to change my mind. So, if your boss says, well, I think you're the best person for the job, and this is such a great opportunity. This is something that I think will really, be really interesting, and this is why I want it done. You might change your mind, or you might not. Bosses are difficult, though.
For sure.
Bosses are difficult because they have power over you. This is something else that I want to work with, and it's especially important in the context of activism and social change, because often we're speaking up to people with power, which can be pretty scary. So your boss can fire you, can have an impact on your career, can, make your life unpleasant. They have that power. So there is some scariness involved. And then, if that's persistent, you've got a choice. Do you stay with that and accept that, or do you leave and do something else? I would never advise anyone to stay in an abusive relationship. So if your boss is abusing you, my personal advice, and I know it's not always easy to follow that, would be get out, do something else, if you haven't managed to speak up to power. And this is also true in activism, in social change areas. We're speaking to power because the person in power often is doing something or is holding something that we don't like. So, let's say we managed to get a meeting with the chairman of a industrial company that's polluting the local river and breaking all kinds of regulations and bribing the local inspectors. I don't think any of us are naive enough to believe that this kind of thing doesn't happen. But let's say you manage to, have a meeting with that person. That's stressful because they have power. You're trying to get them to change something, and you have no power. You just have yourself. Same with the boss, often. So again, one thing that I would recommend is, and this is particularly true in activism. So there's two things I want to say about people who are working in social change and activism. The first is the person that you're trying to get to change what they're doing. We often have what I would call an enemy image about them. So we approach the conversation thinking they're the bad guy. Mm-hmm. They're doing something wrong, and my job is to stop them. And with that energy, we can only get a defensive reaction. We're unlikely to make much progress with approaching people in that way. What I would encourage anyone to do who's in this kind of work or situation, figure out what's important for them. Why are they doing what they're doing? They're not doing it to make your life hell. They're doing it because there's something important they're trying to achieve. And I might not agree with the way that they're doing it, but I need to understand what's important to them. So the owner of the plant that's polluting the water, maybe it's safety. They want to make sure they're making a profit, and this is a quick and cheap way to get rid of their waste. Maybe it's efficiency. Maybe it's ease. They just don't want to, they don't want to go to the bother of packing it all up, finding an appropriate landfill, and making that happen. There's a lot of work to do that. Maybe they're just not aware that this is happening. I wouldn't assume that they're aware. Maybe somebody else is taking responsibility for that. So there's a number of things that might interfere with my ability to have a conversation that's likely to get anywhere with this person in power. And if I can understand what's important for them, then we can have we're much more likely to have a constructive conversation. They're much more likely to hear me if I'm taking into account what's important for them. So if this is the case, what can we do to make it easier and cheaper for you to get rid of your waste? What other partnerships can we bring in? What other resources do we have? So this enemy image idea, kind of focusing away from what I think about the person as being the bad guy, to what's their underlying motivation, what's really important for them. The second thing I want to mention is social change activism is very draining on us as individuals. It takes a lot out of us. Because we're talking to power, because we're dealing in situations that are harming the planet, harming people, harming life in a variety of forms. So we're being faced with difficult, unpleasant situations, and we're talking to power. So we need to access a lot of courage and our own power to be able to try to get things to change. So taking good care of ourselves is really important, and people who are kind of on a mission to change the world rarely take good care of themselves, so they burn out, they lose their energy, and then they're no good to the cause that they're fighting for. So taking good care of ourselves is about making sure we're getting enough rest, making sure we're getting emotional support, making sure that we're not on our own. So that would be strong advice for me to anybody who's working in any form of social change work.
Speaking of social change work, I was very curious to hear your input as a facilitator, because you mentioned earlier that most of your work is online.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do one-on-ones, and we got really good input from you about that. But what about working with groups? It could be, for example, me and my colleagues from the ESC volunteering program. Right now we're going to be doing online and offline workshops. So we already have a bit of experience with the in-person workshops with the high schoolers in Romania. But what about working in groups online? Because many things are not so, let's say, visible there. I'm sure that you already have experienced many, let's say, very unique situations, be it like technical difficulties or the false safety of protection behind, we call this on the internet, it's called a keyboard warrior, when they feel very strong because they're behind the screen and sometimes even without camera, and there's some sort of false security, and sometimes they feel more prone to be more in attack mode, even if it's not their intention always. Sometimes it does happen. So my question is, when it comes to situations like these, what would be your go-to? Let's say you're leading a workshop, and let's say you have 50 people, for example, and let's say you have 1 or 2 people who would absolutely have the intention to cause trouble for the group, for you. What would you do, and what do you do normally?
It's an interesting question, because I was just, as I was listening to you, I was trying to think of situations where this has been true for me, and it hasn't. And then I'm wondering, okay, well, why? Well, because I do recognize this phenomena, this kind of keyboard warrior and people hiding behind the screen. And what I want to do, and I do, is make sure that I'm only working with the people who want to be there. Because my assumption is that somebody who is getting aggressive, abusive, is hiding, doesn't really want to be there. So, in terms of entry requirements, with some of my programs I have interviews with everybody to check, what's your intention being here, what are your objectives, what are you working on, how is this going to be useful to you? So that's one thing. I haven't had any situations of the nature that you're describing. How I tend to manage online work is a principle of less is more. So it seems kind of contradictory, but I prefer to do very little main room work and a lot of breakout work. So exercises, role plays, exploration of around a couple of questions, sharing experiences, learning from each other. Because I have some things to offer as the facilitator or the trainer, but in reality, I said to a group recently that I really like this way of thinking. As the trainer, I probably know more about the subject than any one of you individually, but I know less than the collective wisdom in the room or on screen. If I'm working with 10 people, I'm certain that they have more wisdom, more experience collectively than I do. So there's an interesting dynamic there, where I want to both offer what I have to offer and for them to receive it, but also set up so they're learning from each other. And then everybody feels valued. Everybody is valued, not only feels valued, because their experience, their wisdom, their knowledge has a place, and that would be true with a live workshop or an online. So I want to create an environment where everybody is safe and encouraged to speak up and share their experiences with the purpose of learning from each other. I do a lot of kind of demonstration kind of work or role plays, working with an individual, and I find if you've got a group of 10 people and you're working on, let's say, 2 people's individual situations, there's a huge learning for everybody because we're all human beings. So if one person, is having an issue with their boss, the chances are, and my experience is, that everyone else can find something in their own life where this would be useful by observing and participating in a more of an observational way. So there's a variety of ways in which I want to set up online work, whether it's training, whether it's facilitating. And Zoom is great. It's simple. Breakout rooms are my friend.
Honestly, it sounds like a really safe place to be, your workshops. And of course, nobody would willingly allow participants who don't have the intention for growth, for example. But I would go, for example, in the direction of, let's say, a team leader. Somebody who has the role, the responsibility to work with people who don't really want to be there. Because in the first example, all of the people, I assume, want to be there. They want to grow, they want to learn. But in the second example, let's say the team leader has other bosses as well, but he's also in charge of making sure, the tasks are complete, the people need to more or less be acquainted with each other, some sort of team building or anything like that, something to make a collective of these individuals who are experiencing individual emotions, and not always pleasant ones. Because when it comes to work, sometimes we're human. We don't always like where we work, and sometimes we want to express it. So, for example, if you're in the perspective of somebody who's working with people, and you see maybe not aggressive necessarily, but somebody who's very much rejecting the process and maybe is experiencing something in their personal life, and they're just more, it's leaking out in their professional environment.
Yeah. There's a couple of things come to my mind. One is a bit more radical, which is if there's somebody there that doesn't want to be there, or a whole group of people who really don't want to be there, what am I doing about that? It's like, life is too short to be spending time doing things that we don't want to do. So something is making them there. They're there for a reason, and if they don't want to be there, I would want to question that at a systemic level. If this is an organisation, whether it's an NGO or a business or some other kind of organisation, what is going on that means that we've got a group of people who don't want to be there? It's actually, I think it's really, really challenging, if not impossible, to get anywhere with a group of people who don't want to be there. Because they'll find ways to sabotage what you're doing, what's happening. They'll do that silently, so they'll just be there and then ignore it when they leave. Or they will, some of the things that you're describing is meant they might not more actively sabotage, because if that's a way of getting their power back. I don't want to be here, I feel like I'm forced to be here, so the way that I can feel good about myself is to prove what an idiot trainer you are, or facilitator. Make you look bad, and it's perverse, and it's but I recognise that this happens. So and this is partly a luxury of privilege of age and experience. If I'm contracting with a group, whatever the group is, I will make it very clear I only want to work with people who want to be there. life's too short to work with people who don't want to be there. It's not my job to convince people to be there or to fight. So that's one thing. And there may be situations where, as you say, something is going on with this person, and it's not that they don't want to be there full stop, they just right now they would prefer to be somewhere else. So then I would want to listen to them. Listen to them with empathy, with care. What's going on? What is it all about? And I find that is often very helpful, just to give some space to somebody who's upset about something or something on their mind, to acknowledge it, to give it space, to recognize it, not try to change it. And then I would always want to give people the option to leave. I've been in business training where I'm being paid to work with a group and people have been told to be there. I would always say at the beginning, look, if you don't want to be here, you can leave and it'll be our secret. I don't want to play that game of forcing people to do things that are not in their interests. And another thing that I might sometimes do is just encourage them, look, you may not see the point of this. You may not immediately like it. You may not ever like it. All I would encourage you to do, because you've got nothing to lose, is just give it a go. Just be open that there might be something here that's useful for you. And I don't know if that will happen. Only you will know that. But I would just encourage you to try it and then decide whether it's useful or not. You won't know if it's useful until you've tried it. So there's a few things.
And to conclude this interview, I would like to ask you to think back before you started your journey as an NVC teacher, before you started your journey as a person who's working with so many people in so many environments, in so many contexts. What would you do if you had to start over, but you have all the knowledge and all the experience of you here and now?
There's two things come to mind. So the first is there's a philosophy or a principle that I would want to really hold on to, and that is we're all human beings doing the best we can at all times. Because so often, I lose sight of that. I think you're doing something to hurt me, or I think you're doing something that I don't enjoy, or I'm not able to connect with you. I have thoughts about you, and if I remind myself, you're a human being, just like me, and there's this idea of interdependence. So we have a developmental broadly three developmental stages. When we're born, we're dependent. We rely on other people. We die if we don't have people to take care of us. We then go to, usually through teenage years, independence, where we want to stand on our own feet and make our own way in the world. And then when we mature, we hopefully, but it doesn't happen very often, unfortunately, we get to interdependence, where we recognize our lives are deeply connected. All our lives are deeply connected by virtue of being human. So at some level, if there's somebody in the world who is starving or dying because they're in a war, I'm impacted by that, whether I know it or not. There's a deep connection between us as human beings. And I want to hold on to that, and I would like to know that earlier in life and not value independence as much as I did in my early life. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would, if I could have a conversation with my younger self, I would say, don't be in such a hurry. I turned 60 last year. And the way that I'm kind of holding my life, if I look at the bigger picture of my life, it divides into three sections. From birth to 30, from 30 to 60, and 60 till I die. And if I hold it in that way, then my first 30 years are about learning. It's about discovering, what do I want to do? What are my gifts? What are my Who am I? It's a discovery and a learning. And I don't need to do all that before I'm 20 or 18 or 25 even. I've got a good 30 years to learn, my direction in life, what's important for me. And I would want to, if I could go back in time, I would take that time to really spend time figuring that out. And then the middle period, 30 to 60, that's about, building a family, building a career, making a difference in the world, using what I learnt in my first 30 years for good, whatever that means for me. Maybe that's about wanting to change the world and be in activism. Maybe it's not like that at all. It's about having a nice, safe career where I earn decent money. I buy, have a car, a family. I don't make any judgments about the choices people make in their lives, but I would want to approach that more consciously. So by the time I get to 30, I want to know, okay, this is really what I want to do. And I might change direction a little bit, but I've kind of figured things out. Not by the time I'm 20 or 18. Give myself time. And then this period of life, this latter period, is for me about how can I best contribute, how can I best serve other people. Because I don't have the youth, I don't have the energy anymore. I've still got quite a lot of energy, but and I've still got things to learn. So I don't say that we stop learning, but how can I best continue to contribute? Where am I best able to do that? And for me, right now, that's about supporting other people who want to carry on this work, mainly. So new trainers, supporting other people who are working in social change or activism, or parents. I work a lot with couples. Because couple relationships can be some of the most challenging, in my experience. So that's so that's how if I could talk to my younger self, don't be in a hurry. Remember, we're all human. We're all doing the best we can.
That sounds like genuinely good advice that I would have loved to receive when I was just a bit younger. So it's really beautiful. Thank you for that. And a final question. Do you truly believe that nonviolent communication has the potential to change the world for the better?
I still believe it, and I've seen it. I've seen where it's making a difference. It's not as widespread as I would like, as I thought back then, 23 years ago when I first learnt about it. But it is making a difference. It is already making a difference. In education, so with kids, with parents, in businesses, even in politics and big corporations in small places. So for example, in Microsoft, all senior executives are required to read Marshall Rosenberg's book about nonviolent communication. I'm not convinced that forcing people to do something is necessarily a good strategy, but there is an awareness in some of the largest companies and people in power that there is a better way to communicate than what most of us were taught when we grew up.
Okay, thank you so much, Ian. Thank you for taking the time, and please continue doing what you're doing.
Thank you very much.